Chicopee, a small town in western Massachusetts, always seemed like a quiet and safe place. Life here flowed smoothly, away from the noise of big cities. Green streets with neat houses, where everyone knew their neighbor, created a feeling of comfort and stability. But it was here, in this quiet corner, that in November 2009, an event occurred that shocked not only local residents, but also attracted the attention of the entire country. The Thompson family has long been considered role models. The father of the family, William Thompson, was a respected physician, but after his sudden death in 2005, the family's life changed. Jennifer Thompson, his widow, took over all responsibilities for the home and raising the children. Her children, Michael and Elizabeth, grew up with care and love, but the loss of their father left a void in their lives that no one could fill. Michael, the eldest of the children, has always been reserved and responsible. He was the one Jennifer relied on when she couldn't cope on her own. At 26 years old, he worked as an engineer for a local company and was respected by his colleagues. However, despite the outward calm, tension was growing inside him, which no one suspected. Elizabeth, the younger sister, was the complete opposite of Michael. At 21, she was a bright and cheerful girl who was loved by all who knew her. Elizabeth was interested in art, especially painting, and dreamed of becoming an artist. Her life seemed ideal: talent, support from friends, and love from her mother. But underneath that shiny surface lay dark emotions that only a few knew about. November in Chicopee was always cool. With the onset of autumn, the city plunged into a soft melancholy, and residents increasingly spent their evenings in their cozy homes. It was on such an evening, November 14th, 2009, that something terrible happened in the Thompson house. Jennifer Thompson returned home late at night after work to find the doors to her house unlocked. This immediately caused her concern, since Elizabeth was always careful and monitored safety. Entering the house, Jennifer noticed a strange silence. No sound, no movement, as if the house stood still in anticipation of something terrible. Rising upstairs, she headed towards Elizabeth's room, but stopped halfway when she heard a faint rustling sound from the next room. Michael's room. When she carefully opened the door, her heart sank. In front of her lay the body of her daughter, bloody and lifeless. Jennifer's scream echoed throughout the house, attracting the neighbors' attention. Linda Martin, a neighbor and close friend of the family, immediately ran to help, but after seeing the terrible scene, she could only call the police. The police arrived at the scene and began their investigation, which immediately became one of the most difficult tasks of their careers. Elizabeth's death seemed inexplicable. She had no enemies, no one saw strange people around the house, and not a single thing was missing. The only person who was in the house at the time of the murder was Michael, but his alibi seemed impenetrable. He was at work until the evening. However, Detective Emma Richards has a suspicion that the matter is not as simple as it seems. Emma Richards, an experienced detective, has already seen many tragedies, but this case immediately attracted her attention with its mystery. She noticed that Michael was surprisingly calm and level-headed, even though his sister had just been killed. He remained distant, not showing the emotions that one would expect from a brother in such a situation. Emma decided not to rush to conclusions, but her inner instinct told her that Michael knew more than he was saying. Meanwhile, Jennifer sank into deep depression. The death of her daughter was an unbearable blow for her, which again reminded her of the loss of her husband. She avoided talking about what happened and often became withdrawn, even withdrawing from Michael. The only person she trusted was Linda Martin, who did not leave her for a minute and tried to support her during this difficult time. The local press immediately picked up the story, and Chicopee was thrust into the national spotlight. Reporters did not miss a single detail, trying to unravel the mystery of Elizabeth's death. The city, accustomed to a quiet and measured life, was now under constant surveillance, and every resident felt like part of this tragedy. November 14th, 2009 started out like a normal fall day in Chicopee. The streets were carpeted with yellow and red leaves, and the air was filled with the coolness characteristic of this time of year in Massachusetts. Despite the fog that shrouded the city in the morning, residents continued their usual activities, unaware that this day would be the beginning of a nightmare for them. The morning also started calmly at the Thompson house. Elizabeth woke up earlier than usual and went down to the kitchen to prepare herself breakfast. She always loved the silence of the morning hours, when the house was still asleep and she could enjoy a cup of hot coffee alone. Elizabeth planned to spend the day doing her favorite things, drawing and reading. Lately, she had been increasingly thinking about going to art school, and she was going to discuss it with her mother in the evening. Michael, as usual, left for work early in the morning. His route took him through the city center, where he worked as an engineer for a local construction company. Michael was always punctual, and this day was no exception. He said goodbye to his sister, saying that he would be back late and that he had a lot to do at work. Their conversation was brief, as it had been for the past few months. Relations between them became strained after the death of their father, and although they tried to avoid conflicts, there was always something unspoken between them. Meanwhile, Jennifer Thompson, a nurse at a local clinic, left for her shift around noon. She always took pride in her work and was known as one of the best nurses in Chicopee. Although Jennifer tried not to show her colleagues how hard it was for her to lose her husband, a storm of emotions raged inside her. Her work became her salvation, an opportunity to forget and escape from pain. But this day, despite all attempts to maintain calm, was overshadowed by a premonition of trouble. After lunch, at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Elizabeth decided to go for a walk around the city. Her favorite place was the local park, where she often spent time thinking and observing nature. This park was special to her. It was here that she first began painting en plein air, drawing inspiration from the surrounding landscapes. However, that day the walk did not bring her the usual calm. Elizabeth felt a strange anxiety, although she could not explain its reasons. When she returned home, around 5 in the evening, darkness had already begun to envelop the streets. She locked the door and went up to her room to continue working on her new drawing. But something was wrong. Her attention was distracted by a quiet, almost imperceptible rustling outside the door. Opening the door, she saw only the emptiness of the corridor and heard keys jingling downstairs. It's Jennifer who's returned. Jennifer was exhausted after a long day of work, and when she returned home, the first thing she did was head to the kitchen. She noticed that Michael had not yet returned, and thinking that he was late at work, as always, she did not attach any importance to it. Elizabeth seemed lost in thought and did not leave the room to greet her mother. At 6 in the evening, silence reigned in the Thompson house. Jennifer, tired, went to her room to get some rest. She knew that Michael would be back around 7, and she was going to have dinner ready for him. At this time, Elizabeth locked herself in her room and immersed herself in drawing. In her diary, which she had kept since childhood, the last entries were made, full of uncertainty and questions that she had not yet had time to ask her mother. Around 7 in the evening, when Michael was supposed to return home, Jennifer heard a strange noise coming from the corridor. She thought that her son had finally returned, but when she opened the door, she did not see anyone. She called out to Michael, but there was no answer. Feeling growing anxiety, she decided to check the children's rooms. She went into Michael's room first. The room was empty, although all things were in their places, a common sight that Jennifer is used to. She closed the door and headed towards Elizabeth's room. The door was closed, but the light seeping from under it indicated that Elizabeth was inside. Jennifer knocked, but there was no answer. After trying again and again, hearing nothing, she slowly opened the door. A scene appeared before her that made her heart skip a beat. Elizabeth was lying on the floor next to the bed, her face deathly pale, and blood spreading on the floor. Jennifer froze in place, unable to believe what was happening. The shock covered her completely, and she could not move. Her scream cut through the silence of the house, echoing down the hallways. In a panic, Jennifer rushed to the phone and called the police. But even speaking to the dispatcher, her voice trembled and her hands did not obey. Linda Martin, hearing a scream from the Thompson house, immediately ran to help. But when she saw Elizabeth's body, she was on the verge of fainting. When the police arrived at the scene, everything looked like a bad dream. Detective Emma Richards was the first to enter the room and immediately realized that this was no accident. The blood on the floor, signs of a struggle, the unnatural position of Elizabeth's body, all this pointed to a violent death. However, no traces of a break-in or clear motive for the murder have yet been found. Michael arrived home only an hour after the police began examining the crime scene. He was met by officers who immediately asked him where he had been during the day. Michael explained that he had been at work all day and returned so late because he was late for a meeting. His answers were calm and logical, but something in his behavior caused Emma Richards' internal anxiety. The morning of November 15th, 2009 in Chicopee began with a gloomy, cloudy sky and a cold wind that seemed to bring a heaviness and tension to the air. The murder of Elizabeth Thompson came as a shock to the entire city, but for those involved in the investigation, this event turned into a real mystery. Time stood still, and it seemed that all of Chicopee stood still, waiting for answers. The police station was filled with people, reporters eager for any new information, as well as colleagues and acquaintances of the Thompson family, trying to understand what happened that terrible evening. Among this chaos were detectives who had to sort out all possible leads and put together the scattered pieces of the puzzle. Detective Emma Richards gathered in her office early in the morning, studying documents on the case and thinking about every detail that she had noticed at the crime scene. Emma was an experienced detective with over a decade of experience, and through her years on the force, she had learned to trust her instincts. In this case, something clearly didn't work out. The first thing that caught her attention was the lack of a clear motive. Elizabeth was a kind, talented, and sociable girl who seemingly had no enemies. Her death seemed particularly brutal, suggesting personal motives, perhaps envy or jealousy. But among those whom Elizabeth knew, there was no one who could have such feelings for her. First, the police interviewed all of Elizabeth's family members and closest friends. Michael, her brother, was the first person Emma spoke to. Their meeting took place at the police station, where Michael sat in a small interrogation room. His calmness was almost frightening. He spoke in detail about his day, confirming the alibi he had provided the day before. He was at work from morning to evening and returned home after the police began examining the crime scene. Emma studied Michael carefully as he spoke. His voice was smooth and his manner of speaking confident, but there was something in his eyes that made her wary. His answers were too clear and rehearsed, as if he had prepared for this interrogation in advance. However, despite his internal doubts, the detective had no direct evidence to question his alibi. Emma then turned her attention to her mother, Jennifer Thompson. Jennifer looked devastated and exhausted. Her eyes showed deep pain and fatigue. She could barely speak, and every question was like a blow to her wound. She assured the detective that Michael could not harm his sister, that he had always been caring and responsible. However, Emma noticed how Jennifer avoided direct gaze and often hid her face in her hands, as if afraid to admit something even to herself. James Clark, Elizabeth's best friend, was next in line. He was a close family friend and often spent time with Elizabeth, especially after her father's death. James said that in the weeks before her death, Elizabeth was excited about going to art school and spent a lot of time thinking about her future. He also mentioned some strange conversations they had, but didn't pay much attention to them. When Emma asked him about Michael, James just shrugged and said they didn't have a close relationship. They were not enemies, but there was no friendship between them either. He described Michael as a withdrawn and reserved person who always seemed to be lost in thought. However, James noted that he never noticed anything suspicious about Michael. Meanwhile, Captain Robert Hamilton, Emma's superior, was personally overseeing the investigation. He was an experienced police officer and always paid attention to detail. The captain was in constant contact with detectives, reviewing evidence and reviewing witness statements. He also liaised with the press, trying to prevent leaks of information that could interfere with the investigation. At this stage of the investigation, the police's primary focus was on finding physical evidence. Forensic experts carefully examined the crime scene, analyzed blood, collected fingerprints, and examined possible signs of a struggle. Despite the abundance of materials, not a single piece of evidence has yet led to a clear conclusion. Everything indicated that the killer carefully thought through his actions and tried not to leave traces. Emma Richards continued to study the salient details of the case. She couldn't help but think that something important had been missed. She returned to the crime scene several times, trying to get into the mind of the killer, to understand what could have provoked such a brutal crime. In every corner of Elizabeth's room, She looked for clues that could give direction to the investigation. In parallel with the physical evidence, the police began checking all of Elizabeth's social media connections, phone calls, and emails. They were trying to find someone she might be in conflict with or who might harbor hatred towards her. However, this turned out to be difficult. Elizabeth was popular and friendly, and her correspondence contained nothing suspicious. The more Emma delved into the matter, the more pressure she felt. Time passed, but the investigation stood still. The city demanded answers, the Thompson family was in despair, and Emma herself felt her intuition collide with logic. Her suspicions about Michael grew, but she knew that without evidence, these suspicions remained just speculation. Meanwhile, public opinion in Chicopee was beginning to divide. Some believed that the police were not following up, while others supported the investigation and believed that justice would prevail. Rumors and speculation began to form around the Elizabeth Thompson case, adding even more tension to the situation. In the coming days, the investigation was supposed to move to a new level. Emma Richards understood that the key factor in this case could be the human factor, the emotions, motives, and secrets that could be hidden behind the masks of ordinary people. She was preparing for new interrogations and analysis of evidence, confident that sooner or later the secret of Elizabeth's death would be revealed. Chicopee continued to live its life, but the murder of Elizabeth Thompson remained the main topic of conversation in the city. Despite the best efforts of the police, the case progressed slowly, and each new day without an answer only increased tension among residents. Detective Emma Richards did not give up trying to solve this mystery, feeling that the real reasons for the tragedy are hidden deeper than it seems at first glance. Emma became increasingly immersed in the life of the Thompson family, trying to understand what could lead to such a terrible outcome. She began to study the family's past, including the relationship between Michael and Elizabeth, which at first glance seemed normal. But as she researched, details emerged that suggested otherwise. One of the first disturbing discoveries was that Michael and Elizabeth began to move away from each other after the death of their father. Jennifer Thompson tried to maintain peace and harmony in the family, but the children gradually retreated into their own worlds. Michael became more withdrawn, completely focused on work, while Elizabeth, on the contrary, sought solace in art and communication with friends. There was an emotional gap between them that Jennifer could not bridge. Emma decided to delve deeper into this relationship, starting by talking to Elizabeth's close friends. James Clark, Elizabeth's best friend, became one of the key sources of information. He told Emma that the relationship between brother and sister had never been simple. According to James, Michael always seemed cold and distant, and Elizabeth often complained about his constant absence and indifference. However, James noted that the last few months before Elizabeth's death, relations between them became even more tense. One day, a few weeks before the tragedy, Elizabeth shared a strange feeling with James. She said she felt like Michael was watching her. He appeared in places where she did not expect to see him, and always silently watched her. Elizabeth did not attach much importance to this, chalking it all up to chance or her imagination. But James, having heard her story, noted that there was hidden fear in her voice. Emma couldn't ignore this information. She began to check Michael's alibi more carefully, analyzing his behavior and motives. Despite the seeming impenetrability of his alibi, she began to notice inconsistencies. Michael claimed that he was at work all day, but some colleagues could not remember exactly whether they saw him in the office during critical hours. This made Emma wonder if perhaps Michael wasn't as honest as he first seemed. At the same time, Jennifer Thompson began to remember episodes from the lives of her children, which had previously seemed insignificant to her, but now took on a new meaning. She told Emma about several fights between Michael and Elizabeth that had occurred in recent months. Jennifer had always tried to smooth over conflicts, but now she realized that she had underestimated the seriousness of these situations. One of the quarrels that Jennifer recalled occurred shortly before Elizabeth's death. Michael spoke harshly of her plans to go to art school, calling it a waste of time and money. Elizabeth, who had always been sensitive to her brother's criticism, left home after this conversation and did not return until late at night. Jennifer tried to talk to her, but Elizabeth refused to discuss what happened. Emma also noticed some little things that didn't seem to matter at first glance. For example, A few months ago, Elizabeth unexpectedly changed the code on the door to her room and stopped inviting Michael to her place. She didn't even let him come into her room when she wasn't home. This could indicate that Elizabeth began to fear for her safety. In parallel, the police continued to analyze evidence found at the crime scene. Experts found no signs of forced entry, suggesting the killer was familiar with the house and perhaps even the victim. Michael's fingerprints were all over the place, but that was because he lived in the house. However, DNA testing and other forensic tests have begun to provide the first results that could shed light on the true events of that evening. One of the key points that was revealed concerned the time of Elizabeth's death. According to the medical examiner's report, death occurred between 6 and 7 p.m., just when Michael claimed to be in a meeting. However, calls to his mobile phone were not recorded at this time, and his colleagues could not accurately confirm his presence at the meeting. This again raised the question of whether Michael might have been somehow involved in his sister's death. With each new detail, the picture became more and more confusing. Emma Richards was beginning to realize that there were deep emotions and ulterior motives involved in this case that had yet to be revealed. But every step brought her closer to the solution, and she was determined to find the truth, no matter how bitter it turned out to be. As the investigation reached mid-November, each new day brought with it more questions and fewer answers. Emma Richards knew that the investigation was walking a dangerously thin line between speculation and fact. The alibis provided by all the main players in the case seemed strong enough, but each new discovery made them seem increasingly shaky. The first to come under Emma's close attention was Michael Thompson. His alibi initially seemed unshakable. He confidently claimed that he spent the entire day of November 14, 2009 at work and stayed until the evening at a meeting. Michael's colleagues confirmed that he was indeed present in the office for most of the day. However, with each new interrogation, it became clear that people's memories can be unreliable, especially at critical moments. Emma decided to personally visit the office where Michael worked in order to more thoroughly understand his alibi. A conversation with his boss, David Hansen, shed new light on the situation. David claimed that Michael was indeed at the meeting, but could not remember the exact time of his arrival and departure. The meeting was quite formal and involved several employees, so precise details, such as when each person arrived and left, were not recorded. Michael's colleagues also confirmed that he was at work, but none of them could say with certainty that they saw him throughout the day. Some noted that Michael often left the office to resolve work issues, and this was his usual behavior. This meant that Michael could sneak away for a while without arousing suspicion. Emma also noticed Michael's calls. A check of his phone records showed that his mobile phone was not used during critical hours, which seemed odd, given that he was supposed to be at an important meeting. Michael may have turned off his phone to avoid surveillance, or he may have been in a location where phone use was inappropriate. At the same time, Emma decided to check the alibis of other possible suspects. Attention was drawn to James Clark, a friend of Elizabeth's, who also provided an alibi for the evening of the murder. James claimed that on the evening of November 14th, he was at home studying for an exam at the university the next day. His neighbor, Tom, confirmed that he saw James at home, but it was only in passing. He could not pinpoint what time it happened or how long James was actually in his apartment. To verify this information, Emma turned to the data of the mobile operator. It turned out that James was indeed in the area of his home for most of the evening, but several calls made from his phone left doubts. One of the calls was made in an area several miles from his home, which was not his stated location. James was unable to give a clear explanation for this discrepancy, only noting that perhaps he was just taking a walk near his house to take his mind off studying for the exam. Meanwhile, Jennifer Thompson, Elizabeth and Michael's mother, remained in her grief, but her alibi was confirmed by numerous witnesses. Jennifer was at work during the day, and her colleagues could confirm her presence until the evening. However, Emma continued to question her emotional state. A widow who had lost her husband now had to cope with the murder of her daughter and suspicions about her son. Emma felt that Jennifer was hiding some important details, perhaps without realizing it. Amid these developments, the investigation continued to deepen and new evidence began to emerge. Forensic experts found microscopic marks on Elizabeth's clothing that could not belong to her. These traces could indicate a struggle, but so far, they did not allow one to clearly identify a possible criminal. One of the key moments was the analysis of digital data that Emma commissioned as part of the investigation. The police checked Elizabeth's computer and her correspondence on social networks. In one of the messages sent a few days before the murder, Elizabeth hinted to her friend that she felt unsafe, although she did not specify the reason. This message was the first clear sign that Elizabeth might be wary of someone in her inner circle. Emma decided to focus on these hints, trying to figure out who exactly Elizabeth could be referring to. She again turned to Elizabeth's diaries, which had previously become an important source of information. This time, she turned her attention to notes made several weeks before her death. In them, Elizabeth mentioned that she felt someone's constant surveillance and repeatedly noticed strange sounds in the house when she was alone. These recordings increased Emma's suspicions about Michael, but there was still no direct evidence of his involvement. Emma Richards knew she was on the verge of a solution, but each new discovery raised more questions than answers. The alibis that initially seemed reliable began to fall apart, but this was not enough to accuse anyone directly. The investigation continued to deepen, and Emma knew that even more difficult decisions and unexpected discoveries lay ahead. The investigation, which initially seemed confusing, began to take on new, alarming contours. Emma Richards knew that time was against her. Each new day without significant progress in the case increased tension in the city, and the Thompson family plunged deeper into despair. However, it was precisely at this moment, when hope for a quick solution to the case began to fade, that new evidence appeared that could radically change the course of the investigation. The first important findings were the results of the analysis of traces found on Elizabeth's clothing. Forensic experts determined that microscopic fibers found on her clothing came from carpeting that did not match either the Thompson home or any places Elizabeth frequented. This meant that she may have been in an unknown location before her death, or her body may have been moved after the murder. This discovery was an important step in understanding what happened on that fateful day. Emma decided to check all possible locations where such a coating could be located, and began checking all places that could be associated with Michael or other suspects. One of these objects turned out to be an abandoned building, which was located not far from Michael's work. This building was previously used as an office but has been abandoned for several years. Seeing this place, Emma immediately felt that something was wrong here. She organized a search of the building together with a team of forensic scientists. Inside the building, remnants of old carpeting were found that perfectly matched the fibers found on Elizabeth's clothing. Moreover, stains were found on one of the carpets, which, according to preliminary data, could be traces of blood. This discovery shocked everyone, but it also gave new hope for solving the case. Now, suspicions about Michael have increased. Emma knew her instincts were correct, but more evidence was needed to link Michael to this place and his sister's murder. She decided to increase surveillance of Michael, hoping that he would make a mistake that would give them the evidence they needed. At the same time, she began to study his alibi again, trying to find even more inconsistencies. At the same time, Emma continued to analyze Elizabeth's personal notes, trying to find any hint as to why she might have ended up in this building or who might have brought her there. Her attention was drawn to several entries Elizabeth made in her diary shortly before her death. In them, she wrote about strange sensations and fears that did not leave her in the last weeks of her life. She mentioned that she felt watched and that someone close to her might be hiding something important from her. Emma also turned to Elizabeth's psychotherapist, Dr. Sarah Montgomery, with whom the girl had been dating for several months. Dr. Montgomery was bound by medical confidentiality, but after obtaining consent from Jennifer Thompson, she agreed to provide information about her sessions with Elizabeth. She said that Elizabeth often complained of feeling anxious and depressed. She also mentioned fear of her brother, although she could not clearly explain its nature. Elizabeth was afraid that Michael was hiding something from her, but she never revealed what exactly was bothering her. Emma also decided to review the security cameras located near the Thompson home and Michael's work. One of the videos recorded by a camera in a nearby parking lot showed Michael's car was parked next to an abandoned building on the day of the murder. The time on the recording coincided with the supposed time of Elizabeth's death, which further undermined his alibi. Now that Emma had direct evidence linking Michael to the place where the murder likely took place, she felt the truth was close. However, she knew that this was still not enough to formally accuse him. She needed more evidence, more details that would allow her to reconstruct the events of that day with complete certainty. Meanwhile, Jennifer Thompson, who had remained in the shadows of the investigation all this time, suddenly began to become active. She asked Emma to talk to Michael again. Jennifer admitted that she began to notice changes in her son's behavior after Elizabeth's death. He became withdrawn and distant, avoided conversations, and left the house less and less. Jennifer also remembered that shortly before the tragedy, she found strange objects on Michael that he hid in his room, but then did not attach any importance to it. Emma realized that the time had come for decisive action. She collected all the evidence she had received and presented it to Captain Robert Hamilton. After analyzing the data collected, it was decided to detain Michael Thompson for questioning and further investigation. When Michael was detained, he maintained his calm and confidence, but this time, Emma saw something different in his eyes, fear and worry that he could no longer hide. His behavior during the interrogation confirmed her suspicions. Michael began to get confused in his testimony, tried to justify himself, but more and more evidence spoke against him. The investigation had reached a critical point, and now everything depended on whether Emma and her team would be able to collect enough evidence to link Michael to the murder of his sister. When Michael Thompson was arrested, it spread across Chicopee like wildfire. The city, already shaken by Elizabeth's murder, now finds itself in the spotlight due to the arrest of her brother. Despite the lack of direct evidence, doubts regarding his innocence began to spread among residents. All that was left for the police and Detective Emma Richards to do was follow through with the investigation and make sure the truth was revealed. Michael's interrogation began the day after his arrest. There was a tense atmosphere in the interrogation room. Emma, knowing that this might be her only chance to break him, decided to act carefully but persistently. She began with the usual questions about his relationship with his sister, his childhood and family life. Michael, who still maintained a semblance of calm, answered questions briefly and detachedly, trying not to show emotion. However, as the conversation turned to the last few months before Elizabeth's death, Michael began to show signs of anxiety. Emma noticed how his hands involuntarily clenched into fists when she mentioned their frequent quarrels. Michael tried to deny the significance of these conflicts, claiming that they were ordinary family disputes. But Emma knew that behind these words there was something more, based on the testimony of Elizabeth's friends and colleagues, as well as the study of her diaries. Emma began to reveal to Michael the picture that gradually began to form in her head. She reminded him of how Elizabeth felt persecuted, and how she had repeatedly told her friends about her fear of what was happening in their home. Michael couldn't contain his emotions this time, and looked nervously to the side. Emma decided to press harder, and moved on to discuss specific quarrels between brother and sister. She mentioned the same argument about Elizabeth's admission to art school, after which Elizabeth left the house for several hours. She also pointed to entries in her diary, where Elizabeth wrote about her frustration and growing sense of isolation caused by Michael's behavior. He apparently felt neglected by his mother, whom he also suspected of supporting Elizabeth in her decisions rather than him. Michael began to make excuses, stating that he always wanted what was best for his sister, and that his harsh words were only an attempt to get her to take life more seriously. However, his tone betrayed his inner tension. Emma realized that Michael was hiding something more, and that his anger at his sister might be much stronger than he wanted to admit. She continued the conversation, pointing out the facts that began to form a single picture. Michael was near the abandoned building the day the murder happened. Traces were found on the carpet in this building that matched fibers found on Elizabeth's clothing. Moreover, his alibi, which at first seemed strong, began to crumble under the weight of conflicting testimony from colleagues and telephone records. Emma also decided to address one of the most emotional moments in Michael and Elizabeth's lives, the death of their father. After his death, Michael became withdrawn and increasingly withdrawn from his family. Emma suspected that her father's death was the catalyst for Michael's deep resentment and anger, which he had hidden for a long time, but which eventually burst out. These emotions may have led Michael to project his inner conflicts onto his sister. which may have led to a tragic outcome. During the interrogation, Michael fell silent more and more often. His gaze became empty, and his answers became less and less confident. Emma felt that he was on the verge of a breakdown, but was still not ready to confess. At this point, she decided to use unexpected pressure tactics and asked him directly, "Why were you near that abandoned building that day?" Michael froze. He tried to answer, but the words got stuck in his throat. Emma pressed on, reminding him of the clues found at the crime scene, his inconsistencies in his alibi, and the fact that he was the last person to see Elizabeth alive. At this point, Michael suddenly jumped up and shouted that he never wanted this to happen. This outburst of emotion became the first real crack in his defense. However, before Emma could continue her questioning, Michael retreated into himself again, as if he was afraid of what he had just said. Emma realized that he was not yet ready for a full confession, but she was already sure Michael was hiding something. This day of interrogation was a key moment that could lead to a resolution to the case, but there were still many unanswered questions. Meanwhile, Jennifer Thompson, having learned about the detention of her son, found herself on the verge of a nervous breakdown. She turned to Emma, begging her to find the truth, but was afraid to admit that her son might be guilty. Emma realized that the Thompson family had been destroyed from the inside much earlier than anyone thought, and that their secrets could be the cause of this terrible tragedy. Michael Thompson's interrogation seemed to leave a strong impression on everyone, but it did not bring complete clarity. Emma Richards knew she was on the verge of a solution, but she was missing the last piece of the puzzle to put the whole picture together. Michael remained a mystery, and his sudden outburst of emotion during the interrogation only strengthened her belief that he was involved in his sister's death. However, without hard evidence, this remained only a guess. The next day, Emma returned to the station determined to continue the investigation, despite the fatigue and pressure that was increasingly felt. She knew that every minute spent searching for the truth was important, not only for the case, but also for the mother who was waiting for justice for her daughter. Emma decided to review all the evidence and notes made during the investigation. She focused on data from Michael's cell phone and computer that had previously seemed insignificant, but now, given his behavior during the interrogation, could take on new significance. After several hours of painstaking research, Emma came across an email that caught her attention. The letter was sent from Michael's personal email account 2 days before the murder. The addressee was his work colleague, but the contents of the letter seemed suspicious to Emma. In it, Michael mentioned solving the problem, but did not specify what exactly he was talking about. Emma decided that this might be important and asked IT experts to recover the deleted files from Michael's computer, hoping to find more detailed correspondence. At the same time, Emma returned to analyzing Michael's financial transactions. She was interested in several large cash withdrawals from his bank card a month before the murder. The amounts were significant enough to raise questions. She discovered that some of this money had been transferred to an account registered in the name of a private investigator working in a nearby city. This discovery was an unexpected turn and could explain why Michael hid his actions so carefully. Emma decided to meet with this detective to find out what he might have known about Michael and his actions before the murder. During the meeting, the detective initially refused to divulge details, citing professional ethics, but after much persuasion and an official request from the police, he finally agreed to testify. It turned out that Michael had hired him to keep an eye on Elizabeth for several weeks before her death. Emma was stunned by this information. Michael was clearly hiding his intentions, and spying on his sister only confirmed his manic obsession with controlling her life. According to the detective, Michael wanted to know everything about Elizabeth's movements and meetings. He repeatedly asked who she hung out with, where she went, and if she was seeing someone he didn't know. Although the detective did not know Michael's exact motives, he noted that his client seemed increasingly concerned and even angry as the surveillance continued. Emma returned to the station with new information, realizing that this could be the very piece of the puzzle that was missing. She immediately brought Michael in for another interrogation, but this time she had a different strategy. Instead of asking him again where he was on the day of the murder, she decided to directly accuse him of spying on his sister. When Emma announced the information about the private detective, Michael turned pale. His hands clenched into fists again, and he could barely keep his voice from shaking. He tried to deny his guilt, claiming that the surveillance was necessary to protect his sister, that he was simply worried about her and wanted to make sure she did not fall into bad company. But there was no confidence in his voice. Emma pressed on, getting to the most important point: the motive. She explained to Michael that his control over his sister was not out of concern, but out of jealousy and a sense of insignificance. Michael saw Elizabeth as a threat because she lived her life without obeying his rules. This jealousy probably pushed him to the decision to remove the problem. Michael, realizing that everything was becoming obvious, began to nervously make excuses. He said that he never wanted to kill Elizabeth, that it was an accident. He only wanted to talk to her that day when they met in an abandoned building. According to him, the conversation escalated into an argument. Elizabeth tried to leave and he lost control of himself. This moment became a turning point in the interrogation. Emma felt that Michael was on the verge of full confession, but he still held on, as if hoping that his words could somehow justify his actions. But this time Emma didn't give him a chance to escape the truth. She repeated her questions, clarifying the details, and finally Michael broke down. Tears began to roll down his face as he admitted that he killed his sister in a fit of rage. He hadn't planned this in advance, but his jealousy and pent-up anger over the years had caused him to lose his temper. Elizabeth tried to run away, but he grabbed her, and when she hit her head on the edge of the table, he realized that things had gone too far. He moved her body to an abandoned building, hoping that this would help hide traces of the crime. Emma listened carefully to his confession, realizing that the truth had finally been revealed. Michael was arrested and charged with the murder of his sister. His confession was the final chord in this case, which kept the whole of Chicopee in suspense. With Michael Thompson's confession, the case of Elizabeth's death has finally come to a conclusion. The city of Chicopee, which had long been gripped by anxiety and suspicion, now began to realize the full gravity of what had happened. This tragedy left a deep imprint on the hearts of the residents, and although justice triumphed, its cost was too high. Immediately after Michael's confession, preparations for the trial began. The entire city followed the developments, and every move by law enforcement and lawyers was discussed on the local news and among residents. Michael was accused of murdering his sister and sent to prison to await trial. His confession, despite some confusion in the details, became the main evidence against him. For Jennifer Thompson, her son's arrest and subsequent confession was a blow she could barely bear. Her life, already ruined by the death of her husband, was now in complete chaos. Jennifer closed herself off, avoiding communication with neighbors and friends. She could not believe that her son, whom she loved and trusted, was capable of such a cruel crime. Her pain and guilt for not noticing the signs of the coming tragedy were unbearable. Meanwhile, Emma Richards, who led the investigation, also felt the weight of the case. Despite the successful completion of the investigation, she could not shake the feeling that no one in this story was a winner. Emma understood that Michael was a broken man whose internal conflicts and jealousy towards his sister ultimately led to tragedy. But she also knew that his actions could not be justified, and he had to receive the punishment he deserved. The trial began several months after Michael's arrest. The prosecutor presented the case against him based on his confession, witness statements, and evidence collected at the crime scene. Michael's defense tried to reduce his sentence, arguing that he acted in a state of passion caused by emotional problems and pressure accumulated over the years. But the jury, after hearing all sides, returned a verdict that Michael was guilty of premeditated murder. Michael Thompson's sentence was harsh: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The verdict was met with relief, but also with sadness, as the people of Chicopee realized that 2 lives had been destroyed forever, one taken, the other broken forever. Michael seemed to accept his sentence with resignation, realizing that his actions had forever changed not only his life, but the lives of those around him. After the trial, the city of Chicopee began to slowly come to its senses. People tried to forget about what happened, but the memory of the tragedy continued to live. The Thompson house, where Elizabeth once lived, became a sad reminder of what happened. Jennifer Thompson, having lost everything she held dear, left town shortly after the trial, hoping to start a new life away from the place where her memories haunted her. For Emma Richards, this case was one of the most difficult in her career. She had done her job, but she felt there was more pain and tragedy behind the truth. Her experience has taught her that crimes are rarely committed without reason, and that behind every such case there are complex human relationships that can lead to irreparable consequences. The city of Chicopee may never forget that fall of 2009 when family drama turned to tragedy. But life went on, and people tried to learn from what happened. This story became a reminder of how important it is to notice signs of trouble in others and take timely measures to prevent tragedies like the one that happened to the Thompson family. Emma Richards knew her work didn't end there. New cases awaited her, new challenges awaited her, but the memory of the investigation in Chicopee remained with her forever, as a reminder that in the search for the truth, one must be prepared to face the darkest sides of the human soul. The story of Michael and Elizabeth Thompson was yet another confirmation that evil can lurk where you least expect it, and that behind the mask of ordinary family conflicts, there can be deep wounds that can suddenly turn into destructive actions. This is how this story ended, leaving behind a trace of pain and sadness, but also a feeling of satisfaction that the truth, no matter how bitter it may be, was found and voiced.